So I want to make sure that this part here, where I output the data about the individual questions, is set to a fixed height, and then I want to be able to scroll through the items in that box here. At the moment, that's not the case. So how can we set questions summary to a fixed height? Well, for that, we can go to that widget here, to this building block. And then in there, we want to wrap this column with another widget. With a widget we used multiple times before already, the sized box widget. Now I'm not using it to add some empty spacing between two items as we did it multiple times before in this section, but instead I'm using it to create a box with a fixed height in this case by adding the height argument. And the child widget that is then placed inside of sized box will have to adhere to this height. It will be cut off if it exceeds that height. And here we could set this to, let's say, 300 pixels. I'll actually make this a bit taller later, but I'll start with 300 pixels here. And you see that as I do this, I get a render overflow error, and I again get a warning that basically my column goes beyond these boundaries that I set here. It's taller than these 300 pixels that I assigned. And that's not ideal because that means that indeed I can still see it here, but it's now below this button, which I also have here, because the sized box essentially ends here, and everything below that sized box then in this case still is visible, but is ignored when it comes to the placement of other widgets like this button here. So therefore we must make sure that inside of this box here we can scroll, so that Flutter hides that content and instead allows us to scroll to it. And that can be achieved with help of another widget built into Flutter, because Flutter is all about widgets, as you of course know by now. And it's this column inside of this sized box, which we just added, that should be wrapped with that other widget. So it should be wrapped again, not just by sized box to set this general height, but it should also be wrapped with another widget, which is called SingleChildScrollView, another widget built into Flutter. And this widget kind of does what its name implies. It takes a single child, in this case this column, which of course contains multiple child widgets, but SingleChildScrollView only has one direct child, and that is that column, and it makes that child scrollable, so that if this child, this column in this case, exceeds the boundaries set around it, in this case set by this size box, it becomes scrollable. That's in the end what this SingleChildScrollView does here. Therefore, if you save this, you see the content that was below this restart quiz button is gone, and instead you can now drag here to scroll this widget, or to scroll the content in this widget. And that's exactly the behavior I want here, to make sure that we define a fixed size here, and we can then scroll in this box to still see all the content. Of course, here we would have had enough vertical space to display all the content, but we're also not done with the styling yet, and therefore we might take up more space once we are done. And it is of course also important to know about SingleChildScrollView, because as you're building Flutter apps, you will often have situations where content should be scrollable. You will later also learn about some other widgets that help with scrolling, but SingleChildScrollView is definitely a key widget you should also be aware of.